European countries. Let's talk about the United States for a moment. Since 2009, the United States has been growing at an economic rate of 6.8%. Now, while we look better as compared to Europe, that's the slowest economic growth in a post-war recovery. That means slowest recovery from a recession since World War II. That leaves many people asking, both about the United States and Europe, we're beginning to look a lot like Japan and Japan's lost decade. So one of the ways you would measure if we are beginning to stagnate and look like Japan's lost decade is through bond rates. What do bond rates look like in the United States, and what do they look like in Japan? Now we can put those up. This is the U.S. benchmark bond rate over a 10-year period, 10-year yield for the United States. So when we entered the recession, right there back in 2000, before the recession, 2007, bond rates were just above 5%. 5 years later, United States bond rates are right around 1%. Now let's compare this to Japan. Japan during their recession in the late 80s and their lost decade that followed. When Japan went into their recession, bond rates in Japan were around 8%. 5 years later, same period, 5 years later, Japanese bond rates were right around 3%. The point we're making here is 5 years into a credit crisis, financial crisis, and recession that follows, we're in worse shape than Japan as judged by bond rates. Why do you judge bond rates? This is essentially a message from your lenders suggesting how confident they feel that you're going to experience economic growth and thus inflation. So, are we headed towards a Japanese lost decade? Now, that term, a Japanese lost decade, is a little bit abstract. Let me show you what the Japanese lost decade looked like. Let's put that up. Japan in the 1980s had a $1 trillion economy. It grew up through the early 90s to above a $5 trillion economy. But look at this. From the mid-90s to 2008, you're looking at stagnation. That's what that is. That's the lost decade. 10 years later, more than 10 years, truthfully, in Japan, they hadn't reached the same economic status, the same economy that they were in the mid-90s. That's a lost decade. Again, still, Will, a little abstract. What this means in human terms, human capital, this is fewer people being educated, less investment in education. These are businesses failing. These are careers ending early. This affects how people live, what they have, how well their life is conducted. Now, many suggest if the United States had just grown, continued to grow at the rate it had since the 1950s, our economy would be $1.5 trillion bigger than it is today. It's a number, 1.5, right? Our economy is a $16 trillion economy. That's a pretty big chunk. And again, you have to put that in human terms. That's fewer people working, fewer people educated, fewer businesses in our economy. So here's the question I have. I'll start with you, Matt. First of all, do you see that the United States is venturing into this concept that Japan experienced, this lost decade of economic stagnation?
I don't think we end up there. The comparisons come because what happened in Japan is they lowered interest rates hoping that that would spur on their economy. Obviously, that did not work. The lost decade, actually over a decade. The United States is doing the same thing. We've basically lowered interest rates at a much faster rate, as a matter of fact, than Japan did. We basically lowered what Japan did in 10 years. We did this in a 5-year span. Bernanke has interest rates basically at zero for the most part for borrowing in the Federal Reserve. I don't think that is going to be what spurs on the next rebound, which is what they're hoping. But we have seen that. And let's take a look at the stock market. I know I don't want to get too wonky with this, but look at the Nikkei, which is Japan's version of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. That actually fell, I believe, 44%, 49% in the 5 years after that, after the recession started. The United States, let's say 5 years ago, going back, the S&P is actually just about the same exact level today as we were 5 years ago. So while the Japan market lost 50% of its value, and now, over 20 years later, Japan market is still down over 75% below their peak. Right now, Friday, I don't know where the markets end up closing, but they close right near a 4-year high. So things have turned around. The comparison with the yields, yes, but that's only one factor looking at being what we call a lost decade.
Right, that's one factor. But I hear from you, so you think that because the United States government, the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, acted quicker than the Japanese did, because we brought interest rates down faster, that we're actually avoiding this concept of a lost decade?
Well, we may not be avoiding it completely. I think we're probably kicking the can down the road here right now because they acted so quickly. Bernanke was a student of what happened in Japan, and he had a lot of comments when he was a professor when that was going on. So I think what he saw is it didn't work in Japan, taking that slow route because it was just a slow death what they lived. So he went right at it, pedal to the floor. The problem is, now that rates are at zero, where do you go from here? And that's the big question.
What would you say to people who would respond to this by saying that we're awash in liquidity? We've printed all this money effectively, right? The Federal Reserve has decided they're going to combat all of this by bringing rates so low that the only place to go with your money is the stock market. So it's artificially inflating prices because you're not going to invest in the bond market, which is much bigger, as we all know, than the stock market in terms of overall finances. So what would you say? I mean, is that a realistic way to look at this? That people are putting in the stock market in the hopes that, the music's not going to stop and there's nowhere else to put your money?
Well, that's why we have the market at a 4-year high today. People are anticipating one more round of quantitative easing, which in the past has propped the market about another 25%. That puts the stock market at an all-time high if this actually goes through. So, yes,
could it be a bubble, though? Could we be inflating a bubble in the market?
But the thing is, Buck, same thing's happening in Europe. The European ECB loaned the Spanish banks about 100 billion euro. The problem is that money's moved into the Spanish banks. Spanish banks are okay now, but it's not making it to the people.
They're not lending it.
You're not seeing any growth become of that. The same thing happens here in the United States where the money's going to the banks, but the bank's not making it to our hands to grow the economy.